All right, this is a huge development we've got coming in from the Supreme Court, which you might remember was hearing a case from a petitioner who was asking for a stay on the VHP rallies that are taking place across the country, but largely in the Delhi NCR region right now. This is after what took place in Nuh on Monday. The Supreme Court is refusing to stay the rallies. They've said the matter is going to be heard next on Friday. My colleague, our legal correspondent, Ananya, I know this is breaking news. I don't know how much detail you're going to be able to bring us as we speak, but what context can you bring us about what the Supreme Court had to say?
Well, definitely, Toya. This was a hearing, a short hearing that took place before a bench headed by Justice Sanjeev Khanna and Justice S.V.N. Bhatti. And clearly, the court was, told by senior advocate C.U. Singh that there could be hate speeches that could be addressed at these rallies that have been conducted by, in fact, the VHP and the Bajrang Dal. Remember that there are 23 locations across the national capital where, in fact, these rallies were to take place, and already many of them have already concluded. Only 5 to 6 rallies are now left, and now, in fact, the Supreme Court has first of all granted no kind of a stay on all of these protests. The Supreme Court says that these protests can actually go on, but the police authorities has been asked to maintain a little caution. They've been asked to record in fact these protests that are going on into sensitive areas especially, and a very, very clear direction is given that the police shall ensure that there's no kind of a hate speech that is delivered or some kind of a violence that takes place, but very, very clearly no kind of a stay on the rallies being conducted by the VHP and the Bajrang Dal. And if you remember that these rallies of these 23 locations, only 4 to 5 are now left. Already more than 15 to 20 locations, these rallies have already concluded. Only these 5 to 6 rallies were left now. In fact, the mention of a Mahapanchayat being called was also made by Mr. C.U. Singh. However, the Supreme Court was very, very clear with regards to no kind of a stay on any kind of these protests, but very clearly that no kind of hate speech should be given. At the sensitive areas where protests would be taking place, the police will use the CCTV cameras and would also be using, video cameras to actually record these proceedings. And the same video recordings of all of this would be preserved and might be presented before the topmost court of the country on Friday when the matter would be heard.
Ananya, I do want to understand, did the Supreme Court elaborate in their pronouncement on why they didn't believe that these protests should be stopped? Was it largely the timing that most were over, or were there other reasons?
Well, see, there is a right to protest that is there under the Constitution of India, and though there was no particular explanation given out by the Supreme Court as to why it is not staying these rally, but very clear directions and clear cautions were already given out to the police authority, and there was no such reason to actually stay these protests when already directions were issued to, in fact, the police authorities to actually record what is happening at these protest sites, to use the CCTV cameras to record it, and to preserve these video camera recordings. And apart from that,
Ananya, let me just clarify with you. You're saying that the police has been told they must record the proceedings. I wasn't entirely clear. Had the police already been told to record the proceedings before these protests took place, or is that something the Supreme Court has just said?
This is a fresh direction issued by the Supreme Court of India, clearly asking that, the police authorities should record, in fact, these protests that are going on, specifically in the sensitive zones, and, in fact, as and when they require it. And if at all there is some kind of a hate speech or there is a possibility of the violence, they shall stop and use, and in fact, in sensitive areas, paramilitary forces can also be deployed, is what the Supreme Court has said. That very clear direction, Stoya, that comes in from the Supreme Court is that, see, should not be any kind of a hate speech, any kind of a violence or damage to any kind of property, or at least public property as well. And the protest can actually go on without any kind of a harm being caused to the people, either physically or, by way of words.
Okay. Ananya, bring us more context. We saw visuals right now from Mirzapur. We were actually showing our audiences visuals from different protests, but in Mirzapur in particular, you could see effigies being burnt. Does that kind of action be counted? Is that counted as hate speech? How is it defined typically when it comes to protests?
Well, hate speeches are basically words that are used against a particular community that could incite a particular the other community to commit violence. That's what exactly is hate speech. But whether burning of effigies would count as one is something that is a discretion of the court to decide. And we would refrain from commenting upon as to what would contain hate speech. But at the same point of time, the Supreme Court giving clear directions, no kind of a stay on any of these protests, asking police to record these protests protests that are taking place in the sensitive zones, and very clearly use of force to be done if at all there is something uncanny, there is something extraordinary happening, or some kind of a hate speech being given, or violence is about to be committed in a particular zone.
Okay, and Ananya, one more question for you, so that our audiences can have some legal context to this decision. Can you tell our audiences, in the last decade, because this point you raised, that of free speech and the importance of that too, in the last decade, has the Supreme Court at points ever stopped a protest from taking place?
Yes, Supreme Court has many a times, put a halt on various, protests being taking place. And in fact, the case in which this particular intervention application is also filed is a judgment of the Supreme Court in the Shaheen Abdullah case, which is with regards to hate speeches and how hate speeches are to be dealt with, and what atmosphere does a hate speech creates. And if you remember, this judgment had come in a few years ago, and it very clearly laid down as to why hate speeches are something that could ignite violence. It's something that could give rise to a violence in a particular area where such a hate speech is given, and that has to be dealt strongly, is what the Supreme Court judgment in 2018 had said. This was the Shaheen Abdullah case in which this was a judgment by Justice K.M. Joseph-led bench, and now in this particular matter itself, intervention application, that is IA, was filed, and these directions have now been passed.
Okay, I want to ask you, Ananya, because you talked right now of hate speech and the fact that the Supreme Court had made it clear that no hate speech should take place. Some experts say that when it comes to Indian law, there is no specific legal definition for what hate speech is. Is that accurate or no?
Well, the Indian law does not only confine to the Constitution of India, it also comes in and various, judgments are considered, and that's why they are called case laws. And these judgments have clear definitions of a hate speech being given. Hate speech is something that ignites, the words ignite a